Okay, so, everyone's talking about it right now, the Taiwan Strait. It feels like it's always sort of simmering.
Yeah.
But things took a pretty sharp turn. I mean, starting last Tuesday, April 1st, 2025, China launched these really significant, big military drills right around Taiwan. And you sent over a ton of information on this, a bunch of news reports, expert analysis. So let's dive in.
Let's do it.
And really figure out what's going on here? What do these drills mean, and why should everyone be paying attention?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is more than just, routine kind of saber rattling that we sometimes see.
Right.
When you actually get into the specifics of what these exercises involved and the entire context surrounding it, you really start to see, I think, a clearer picture of what China's long-term goals are, how Taiwan is interpreting these actions. And it really highlights, I think, the incredibly delicate balance of power in the entire Indo-Pacific region. So we've got a lot to dig into here. We've got on-the-ground reporting of what actually happened.
Yes.
We've got people trying to read between the lines and figure out, okay, what's the motivation? What's the real message here?
Exactly, yeah. So let's get right to it. So what was the match that lit this particular fuse? It doesn't seem like this was a bolt from the blue. There were things sort of leading up to this.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if we look at the sources, the announcement of these really pretty extensive drills came really quite shortly after that visit to Asia by U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth.
Right.
And, during that trip, he was making some pretty strong statements about the need to really push back against what he called China's aggression. And so I think that rhetoric, Beijing definitely took notice.
Yeah, they seem to have taken notice, and that seems to tie directly into the stated reasons that they gave for doing this. I mean, they weren't exactly shy about, telegraphing their intentions, were they?
Not at all.
No.
They said very explicitly that these drills were a severe warning, a forceful containment against Taiwan independence, and a stern warning aimed at, separatist movements. And I think it's really crucial to connect this to the recent inauguration of Taiwan's new president, President Ching-te. Beijing views him as having these pro-independence leanings, and they've been pretty vocal in their criticism of some of the national security measures that he's put in place.
You're talking about that 17-point strategy, right?
Yeah.
That seems to have really gotten under Beijing's skin. So what exactly did that involve?
Yeah, so the 17-point strategy really encompassed a whole range of things. One of them was, allowing espionage cases to be tried in military courts. And, Beijing views that as really
targeting them.
Targeting potential, mainland Chinese intelligence activities.
Interesting.
There were also things like stricter immigration rules for Chinese citizens seeking permanent residency in Taiwan. So, from Beijing's perspective, these are moves that are designed to really solidify Taiwan's distinct identity, reduce China's influence on the island.
Right.
And so you can see how they would see that as provocative.
Yeah, for sure. And then, in addition to all that, there are also a few other things sort of brewing in the background, right, that added to that sense of tension. I remember reading about some incidents with Chinese ships.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in the months leading up to these drills, Taiwan had detained the crews of Chinese cargo ships twice for allegedly cutting undersea internet cables.
Oh, wow.
And these are vital communication links. That's definitely something that's going to raise concerns.
Yeah.
And then more broadly, we've seen just this sustained increase in the number of Chinese warplanes and Navy vessels that are operating in the vicinity of Taiwan.
Right.
So it's been this, period of really heightened military activity.
Yeah. So you've got all of these things happening, right? You've got Hegseth's pretty strong words. You've got President Li's new policies.
Yeah.
You've got these incidents at sea. And then China's Taiwan Affairs Office.
Yeah.
They really made it personal, didn't they?
Right.
They specifically said these drills are aimed at President Li himself.
Yeah, that's such a key element, I think, because they're directly accusing him of clinging to this Taiwan independence stance and of actively stirring up anti-China sentiment within Taiwan. So, to me, that kind of personal targeting really underscores how much political messaging is embedded in these military exercises.
Yeah, totally. So I think we've got a pretty good grasp now of the why behind these drills.
Yeah.
let's talk about the what a little bit. What did these exercises actually involve? They sound pretty significant, like a pretty big flex of military muscle.
Yeah, it was a pretty significant undertaking. So the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, they mobilized forces from their Navy, their Air Force, ground forces, even their rocket forces.
Wow.
And the drills themselves were focused on practicing a whole variety of different military actions.
Like what specifically?
Okay, so some of the things that were mentioned in the official descriptions were things like practicing air interception.
Okay.
So that would be, their Air Force simulating how they would stop incoming hostile aircraft or missiles.
Right.
They practiced assault on maritime targets, which suggests they were doing exercises attacking ships at sea.
Okay.
They were practicing strikes on ground objects.
Interesting.
Which, implies simulations of attacks on land-based infrastructure within Taiwan.
Okay.
And then they were doing things like joint blockade and control.
Oh.
So rehearsing how they might effectively cut off Taiwan from both sea and air.
So it wasn't just like individual units off doing their own thing. It sounds like there was a lot of coordination.
Yeah, exactly. There were reports of formations of vessels and aircraft working together, all coordinated with, conventional missile systems and these long-range rocket capabilities.
Wow.
And one expert, Professor Zhang Qi from China's National Defense University, he said that the aim was to test their ability to conduct these really integrated joint operations to achieve operational control in a conflict scenario.
Right.
And to execute these multi-directional precision strikes.
Wow. So this is like next level stuff.
Yeah. And he even went so far as to say that these kinds of really complex integrated drills are becoming, quote unquote, the new normal.
The new normal. That's a phrase that makes you sit up and pay attention.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
Because, what does that suggest about, is this the kind of level of military activity we're going to see more and more regularly?
Exactly.
So that's something that's worth really thinking about.
Totally. And then there's also, of course, the aircraft carrier, the Shandong, which also made a pretty significant move.
Yeah, the Shandong aircraft carrier group was tracked entering Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone.
Right, they're ADIZ.
They're ADIZ, exactly.
And that's, obviously not sovereign airspace, but it is an area they monitor for any potential, hostile aircraft. So having a big aircraft carrier like that roll in definitely sends a message.
For sure. It's a huge projection of Chinese naval power into a very sensitive area.
Yeah, and it wasn't just their military involved. It seems like their Coast Guard also played a role.
Yeah, that's right. They were conducting what they called law enforcement patrols in the waters around Taiwan. And these patrols reportedly included drills focused on how to intercept and even detain vessels.
Wow. So really a multifaceted exercise here involving, virtually all arms of their military and sending a really, it seems like a pretty deliberate signal about what they're capable of. So how did Taiwan react to all this happening right on their doorstep?
Well, unsurprisingly, their Ministry of National Defense issued a really strong condemnation of the drills. They called them blatant military provocations that threaten regional peace and security. So, a very strong statement.
Yeah. And it sounds like they weren't just, releasing statements. They were actually actively responding.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
They reported tracking, a significant number of Chinese vessels and aircraft, including the movements of the Shandong. And in response, Taiwan mobilized its own air and naval assets, dispatching aircraft and ships to monitor those exercises.
Right.
They also deployed land-based missile systems, putting them on alert, ready to respond if necessary.
Right. And I also saw something about the presidential office setting up a special task force.
Yeah. They established a central response group to really closely monitor the situation, coordinate Taiwan's actions. And you had some top officials, Joseph Wu, the Secretary General of Taiwan's National Security Council. He was using some pretty strong language. He described the drills as reckless and irresponsible.
Wow.
And then Defense Minister Wellington Koo, he echoed those sentiments, and he said, very clearly that China's actions were a destruction of regional peace and stability.
So really strong, unified response from Taiwan's leadership. But I did come across some interesting reports that sort of suggested that the public in Taipei might have had a bit of a different reaction, perhaps a little less overtly alarmed than the government.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point, and I think it's crucial to consider because while the official condemnation was very clear, some reports did note a more kind of muted reaction from some people in Taipei.
Interesting.
There were comments from residents who were expressing, more immediate concerns about things like the economy and even U.S. politics.
Yeah.
One noodle seller was quoted as saying that, most people don't pay much attention to these kinds of exercises anymore. And so, that suggests maybe a certain level of resilience, maybe a degree of habituation, or even, a strategic calculation to not overreact to what's become kind of a recurring event.
Right.
So it's interesting to think about whether, Beijing's intimidation tactics are really having the intended psychological effect.
Yeah. Is it losing its power?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay. So, we've got the government sounding the alarm, but maybe the public's a little more accustomed to this now.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's zoom out a little bit.
Okay.
And look at the broader international context here. We talked about Hegseth's visit, but what's the bigger geopolitical messaging at play?
Well, it's interesting. Our specific sources don't actually detail any direct statements from other governments.
Okay.
Specifically on these April 1st drills.
Okay.
But we can definitely see the bigger picture of U.S. policy here shaping the environment. I mean, the United States has these huge alliance structures in the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
And there's that long-standing commitment, regarding Taiwan that we've talked about.
Yeah.
That necessitates treating threats to the island with grave concern.
Right.
So that's always sort of the background.
Yeah, and then you've got Hegseth coming in and saying, we've got to counter China's aggression.
Right, exactly.
So that clearly aligns with that policy.
Exactly. His focus on strengthening alliances with partners like the Philippines and Japan is all about building that credible deterrent in the Taiwan Strait.
Okay.
And we also saw the de facto U.S. embassy in Taipei issuing statements of support for Taiwan.
Right.
Which is another signal of that U.S. commitment.
Yeah, it definitely seems like these drills weren't just like, a message to Taipei.
Yeah.
This was also a signal to Washington.
Right. I think that's a very likely interpretation.
Yeah.
The timing of these exercises so soon after Hegseth's visit.
Yeah.
And, there's this sense of a shift in U.S. strategic focus towards the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
Which even internal analyses from the Taiwan government suggest is happening.
Interesting.
That really points to Beijing wanting to push back against what they see as increasing U.S. involvement in this issue.
Okay, so we've got these two big players reacting. And then it's interesting to note that the Philippines, their reaction was pretty significant as well.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. The Philippines military chief actually issued instructions for their forces to prepare to rescue Filipino workers who are in Taiwan.
Wow.
And there are a lot of Filipino nationals who are working in Taiwan. So that really underscores the broader regional anxieties that are out there.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we've got China sending messages to both Taiwan and the U.S. So let's dig a little deeper into that. What were they really hoping to communicate with these drills?
So the main message, as they themselves articulated, was a very clear warning to Taiwan.
Yeah.
Don't pursue any steps towards formal independence under President Lai's leadership.
Okay.
We are prepared to use force as a potential option to prevent that.
Wow. So not mincing words at all.
Not at all. And I think, beyond those words, the scale, the nature of the maneuvers themselves was a huge part of that message as well. It's this big demonstration of their growing military capabilities.
Yeah. It's one thing to say it, but it's another thing to actually show it.
Exactly. It's about showing that resolve as well.
Right. And it's also saying that to the United States, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they're signaling to the U.S. that they are not happy with what they see as interference in this issue.
Okay.
And that they are absolutely determined to defend what they see as their territorial claims.
Right. And we also saw some pretty aggressive rhetoric.
Yeah.
Maybe even some straight-up propaganda coming out of Beijing.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, the PLA released videos that depicted President Lai in a very, very negative light. Even using, derogatory terms and that kind of propaganda is designed to, delegitimize his leadership.
Right.
Demonize pro-independent sentiments. So it's all part of that messaging.
Right. But it's interesting to note that reports suggest that this kind of intimidation hasn't really swayed public opinion in Taiwan all that much.
Yeah, I think that's a key point because it suggests that maybe there's a miscalculation on Beijing's part. While they're ramping up the military pressure using this aggressive rhetoric, it's not clear that it's actually translating into a shift in public opinion within Taiwan.
Right.
Where there's a very strong sense of identity and a desire for self-determination.
Yeah. So we've talked about the why behind these drills. We've talked about what they involved and who the messages were directed at. So if we take a step back now and look at the bigger picture, what are the strategic objectives that these drills reflect?
Right.
I mean, this is about more than just this immediate situation, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think these drills are a really tangible manifestation of several long-term strategic goals for China. First and foremost, obviously, it's about preventing Taiwan from formally declaring independence. Secondly, it's about constantly demonstrating and testing their military capabilities for a potential forced reunification scenario, even if that's not something that's imminent. Thirdly, it's about responding to and pushing back against perceived U.S. interference and what they see as an internal affair.
Right.
And then I think you've also got this element of really normalizing the military pressure on Taiwan.
Right.
You know, we heard that professor talking about these integrated drills as the new normal.
Right.
So it's about constantly applying pressure, trying to erode their resilience, and potentially deter international support.
Okay. And then finally, you know, it's also about reinforcing China's broader territorial claims.
Absolutely.
Right? And asserting their regional influence.
Yeah. I mean, this goes beyond just the Taiwan Strait.
Right.
You know, they've got claims in the South China Sea. They've done exercises near Australia and New Zealand in the past.
Wow.
So this is part of a much bigger picture.
So these aren't just isolated exercises. This is all part of a bigger and more complex strategic puzzle that they're putting together. And then, of course, the immediate consequence of all this is that you've got these heightened tensions, not just in the Taiwan Strait, but across the whole Indo-Pacific.
Right. And the more military activity you have, the greater the risk of, you know, miscalculation, misunderstanding, accidents, exactly.
It's going wrong.
Unintended escalation.
Right.
So, yeah, it's a very, very tense situation.
Okay, so let's bring it all together. What are the key takeaways from this deep dive into these drills for our listeners?
Okay, so I think the key takeaway is that China's exercises near Taiwan are a very, very deliberate display of force.
Yeah.
They're driven by these really clear political objectives. And those objectives are mainly about deterring Taiwan from pursuing independence under President Lai.
Okay.
And signaling that resolve to the United States. So this is all happening against this backdrop of already very complex and escalating tensions.
Right.
Which makes the Taiwan Strait a really critical area to watch.
Right. Absolutely. And it feels like, you know, this is a situation that is not going away anytime soon.
No.
So the question is, are these drills, you know, are they becoming routine? Or is each one a new escalation?
Right.
So as we move forward, what should our listeners be paying attention to?
I think the key thing is to watch not just the scale and frequency of these drills, but also the rhetoric.
Right.
What are they saying? What's the tone?
Yeah.
Any shifts in military deployments or force postures, those are going to be really important clues. And maybe most importantly, pay attention to how these actions are being perceived and responded to, both by the people of Taiwan and by the international community.
Right.
Because ultimately, it's that interplay of all those factors that's going to shape the trajectory and the stability or instability of the Taiwan Strait.
A lot to keep an eye on.
A lot to watch.
Thanks for breaking it all down for us.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back next week with another deep dive into the most important stories of the week.